Welcome to In the Paint Shop. Today we're going to be doing a teardown and rebuild on the SATA JET NR3000s. We've got a couple of examples of the gun here. We've got a digital version and a non-digital version. They are pretty much identical, other than the digital display on the one, and on the back side there's a couple slight differences. We have a battery access for the digital, and on the non-digital it is actually machined slightly different for ambidextrous controls. You can actually, there was a kit available to put a fan control on the back side of this version. But other than that, they're pretty much the same. So we're not going to rebuild both of them. We're just going to take a look at the digital. And we're going to go over how to completely tear this gun down, how to clean it, and then how to reassemble it. As for any HVLP spray gun, the first thing I like to do when disassembling them is to remove the needle. And there's a couple reasons for this. If you disassemble it in the wrong order, you can actually damage the fluid tip or the needle or both. And by starting here, we're kind of eliminating that chance. So we're going to remove the needle stop, the spring, and the needle should just pull out. This needle stop actually has a set screw on it that we can remove, and I'll show you how to set that up during reassembly. The next step, we're going to remove the air cap. And this air cap can actually be disassembled a little bit further. It has a split ring on the outside. If we put a little screwdriver in here, we can kind of expand that split ring. Move it out of its recess. And we can disassemble it that far. There's also a little black gasket in here. I almost recommend not taking that out. That can be damaged fairly easily, and they can be hard to come by if you do damage it. So I normally just leave that in there, in that recess. You can still easily get a brush in there to clean that out, if need be, without taking that out. But if you want to soak these parts, this is a great way to tear them apart and soak them. I'll set those aside for now. We're going to remove the fluid cap at this point. And we want to be careful that we don't ding up the tip of it. And this is the reason why we want to remove the needle before we take this out, because we don't want the spring tension of the needle against the back side of this fluid cap as we're spinning it and taking it out. This is where we could damage parts. But since that's out, I'll go ahead and thread that off. Set that aside. Now we have a black plastic ring in here. This is called the air distribution ring. And it actually requires a tool to take that out. The guns come with a little tool, but if you don't have this, you could make do with maybe a couple paper clips bent at an angle or something similar. What this does is You slide this in to a couple slots and then just pull up on it with a little bit of a wiggle. Then we can set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to take off our trigger. The trigger is held in place by a couple of little clips. So we're going to carefully take these clips out. And I say carefully because they have a tendency to fly. So I like to keep my thumb on the back side while I'm pushing it off just to kind of capture it. Now the bottom one. And these can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes they try to spin on you. If you can get it out far enough that you can get the tip of the screwdriver in, it helps a lot. Okay, there's our clips. And our bottom pin has fallen out. And the top pin. Now, there's going to be another little washer that comes out when I take this out. And it sits right there. It's a little bent washer. And its purpose is just to kind of keep the trigger from rattling around. It just adds a little bit of tension to the side to take that play out. Got our trigger. At that point, this air piston will just pull out. It's only captured by the trigger when it's in place. We can take out our air control at the back. And it requires a small Allen key. And this has some spring tension underneath it, so I'm kind of holding it on. It's not enough to make it launch usually, but just in case. And this is kind of an Allen key that's kind of a long pin. Okay. Now, if you want to, you can pull this little plastic cap off the spring. We don't really need to, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave that on. And in the back of this, there's a small screw, little Phillips head screw, that we could take out to disassemble this part for some thorough cleaning. But it's usually not necessary. Usually a soaking and a little brush like that is plenty to get in there and get everything clean. So I'm just going to leave that assembled. Now, if there's another piece here at the front of the piston, we don't usually need to take that out to clean, but I'll go ahead and take it out to show you how it works. This is actually a special little tool that we're going to use a couple times in this gun. It's an Allen key, but at the tip, it's ground to a smaller radius circle. And I'll show you how that works. These came with the guns initially. If you don't have it, if you've lost it, I have seen them. They're available on eBay. So you can pick one up there. It really makes it a lot easier for reassembly. So this comes off. And that little piece will come off. But like I said, there's usually not a reason to take that out. So typically, even when I'm doing a deep cleaning, I usually just leave that piece in. But we'll take it out just to demonstrate. The next thing we're going to take out is our needle packing, which is in this portion of the gun, and it's actually the gasket that the needle rides on for a seal in there. And that is where this tool is very valuable. Like I say, not just to disassemble it. You can disassemble it without the tool, but reassembly it makes it so much easier. The tool comes in from the rear, and it's a little Allen socket on the back. So now we have it in all the way. We are going to unscrew it. Again, a little bit of spring tension, but usually not much. And what I have found quite often is when you're disassembling these to clean, the little needle packing tries to stay in there. So what I will do is take the back side of my needle and kind of push that Allen key out. And usually that's enough to kind of dislodge our packing. And there you can see it come out. That's our needle packing right there, that little white piece. Along with the spring. So we're going to pull these out. And this is that little sub-assembly. How that works to seal is the needle will pass through this piece, and the paint is kept from coming out the back side of the gun by a friction fit between this packing and the needle. If this packing gets worn, or if the needle gets worn, you can actually have a little bit of paint leak out the back of the gun, or you can have some air leak into the gun, which will cause kind of a stuttering of the gun. It'll almost sound like a little bit of a machine gun, as it's sucking air into it. So if you have that issue, this is a good place to look for the problem. These needle packings are available to replace, and you need to do it every once in a while. It's not a high use item, but you know, if you're using the gun on a daily basis, I don't know, maybe once a year, you're probably going to replace that. So let's set those aside for now. Also, if you have a gun that is having problems with when you let the trigger off while you're spraying and it still sprays a little bit, or maybe you have a gun that leaks a little bit of paint out the tip, this is probably where your issue's at. You probably have a little bit of buildup of paint on the needle, and it's not letting the needle slide shut again to shut it off. So usually if you get the needle cleaned and this packing cleaned, that'll solve that problem. Okay, further into the teardown. We're going to remove this fan control. Which is just a little Phillips screw. The factory, they did use a little bit of blue Loctite on it, so it might be a little bit tight. And you can put some back on during reassembly if you want. Fan control lifts off. And now we have our fan control air distribution valve. We can use our SATA wrench to spin that out. And this is about as far as you want to take this apart. Usually I will just soak this, clean it up good, but I don't want to take this apart any further. There's actually a very small green O-ring on here that you need to be sure is there and undamaged, or you'll have some air leakage out. And as we put that together, I'm going to show you a little trick to make sure we don't damage that, because these do get damaged pretty easily. About the only other thing we can take apart on this is this little piece in the bottom. And this really doesn't serve a purpose other than they came with some different colored plastic pieces. And the purpose of that was so you could identify the guns. If you had 2 or 3 of them that were identical but maybe different tip sizes, or if you were going to use one for sealer, one for base and stuff, you could put these different colors on here to help identify the gun. Now, we do not want to disassemble the front of our digital display. It looks like it's something that you could. There's a couple Allen keys there. Don't take this off. The instructions from SATA say that if you disassembled this, this is not user serviceable. You're going to have to send this back to SATA to get rebuilt. So we do not want to remove these. And the same goes for this piece at the bottom. Again, it looks like you could throw a wrench on it and back it off. This is part of our digital valve, of our micrometer. Again, SATA says if we take this out, it's going to have to go back to SATA to get rebuilt. And we don't want to do that. So that piece and that piece will stay in. To remove our battery, this is our battery cover on the back side. And there's our little coin battery that operates it. It's probably hard to see. This is a CR1632 battery. So when you need a battery replacement, it's as simple as that. Take that cover off, take the battery out, pop a new one in, and you're done. So that is as far as we're going to take this gun apart, which is pretty much everything. This would be a good point to go ahead and submerge a lot of these parts. On these digital guns, I don't like to submerge any of this stuff. So maybe I'll put it in a smaller cup and put it in vertically so that maybe the fluid's up to about here. But you really don't want to do a lot of cleaning, and especially you don't want to get any solvent in here. So if you're doing some scrubbing, be sure that cover's in place. And I like to put something on the air intake so we don't get solvent down into there. So we want to protect our electronics. If you're dealing with one of these non-digital guns, then you can tear it apart, soak the whole thing. You're not going to hurt anything. Okay, as far as cleaning this, most of the time, a little brush like it comes with is enough to clean most everything. This is a SATA brush. Any small brush is gonna do a great job. Something along the lines like a small toothbrush is gonna be great for getting into a lot of these parts too. One thing I like to do that works great for me is I will take a standard acid brush and then cut the bristles off real short. That makes them pretty stiff, and it does a great job of getting in here and cleaning out a lot of these parts. You know, you can get in a lot of places with a brush like that and get them real clean. Your SATA brush is going to be great for getting into here, areas like this. But you're also going to want some smaller brushes for getting into areas like our air horns on the air cap. And, you know, maybe the fluid tip or these little air passages. So Quite often you can get little brushes like this with like a spray gun cleaning kit, and I highly suggest it. One area on these guns that's really hard to clean, that causes a lot of grief, are these tiny little holes in your air cap. If these get plugged up, they really mess up your pattern. We have to be very careful about how we clean those though, because if we damage those at all or cause them to get misshapen, then our pattern is terrible. So SATA actually makes a special cleaning tool for that. And it looks like a little needle. And I will spin this, and hopefully you can kind of see the tip of it flash a little bit. And the reason for that is, on the narrow end here, it's actually ground into the shape of a triangle. So what you do is you shove it through the little holes, and you can turn that, and that triangular shape will actually clear out those holes without damaging the air cap. So, you know, years past I've seen people use things like a little file for cleaning the tips of a welder or something. It's the absolute worst thing you can do. You're going to be enlarging these holes, then you've basically ruined the air cap. So you want to be very careful the way you clean those so that you don't damage it, you don't enlarge them. The larger holes, we can use an airbrush or a little small brush to clean those. And I'm probably not going to show up on camera, but you want to be sure when you're done that you can look through those holes and look at them, make sure they're all open, and they all look like they're the same size. But other than that, a lot of these parts are going to get cleaned up just by putting them in some thinner, letting them soak, and again, using a little brush to clean them up. So this one was pretty well clean when I took it apart. So we're just going to start putting it back together now. Okay, we've got our NR3000 cleaned up, ready to reassemble. We're basically just going to put it back together in the opposite order that we took it apart. A lot of the parts really aren't going to matter if we do them one thing ahead of the other. There's a few that will. There's a few that if we put one part in, we're not going to be able to get the previous part in. And there's a couple where we could actually damage parts if we do them in the wrong order. I'll put my battery back in. Going to put my little ID piece back in. And while we're assembling this, we want to get parts snug, but we don't want to over tighten anything. Going to put this piece back in. I'm honestly not sure what they call that. Going to put my valve in. And what we want to do on this is we want to use a product, this in particular or something very similar. This is a spray gun grease that SATA makes. We're going to use this on several parts of the gun, assembling it. Some to make it perform better, some to prevent damage. But this little green gasket gets torn very easily while we tighten it. if there's friction as it seats. It's a pretty fragile little thing. So we want to lube that a little bit so it kind of slides into place against its mating surface instead of catching, and as we torque, it'll rip it. So just enough to kind of lube it up. And the great thing about this product is it will not cause fisheyes. It's designed to use with spray guns. So, we don't want to get overboard using it, but you don't really have to worry about the fisheyes either. Snug it down. What I like to do is open it up all the way, the valve, which would be counterclockwise to open my fan up. And then I will take this off and align it with some point on the gun. That way I can kind of visually see if it gets bumped, I know that my fan is closed down a little bit. Again, you can use a little bit of blue Loctite reassembling that if you want. And if you have trouble keeping it snug, then I would suggest it. But a lot of times I don't reinstall it because I'll take it off every once in a while to clean it. Okay, we've got that reinstalled. I'm going to put my air valve back in. This is another spot where we're going to use some grease just to help things run a little smoother. Not much, just a little bit. Now, we've got a hole in one side of this. If you can see that, that goes down. And you can see that it's cut away a little bit on one side to allow it to rotate against that locking pin. So that needs to be in the correct position too. The spring tension is going to try to hold it out, so I'm going to hold it in while I reassemble that pin. Again, snug, not over tight. We don't want to lose it in the middle of a paint job, but we don't want to damage anything from over tightening it. Okay, we've got that in. We're going to put this piston back in. A little bit of grease on this guy too. Okay, the next part we want to put in is we want to assemble our needle packing. This is where this tool is very valuable. We're going to assemble the parts on this tool before we install it. We've got our retaining screw, our spring, and our needle packing. We're going to use some grease on these parts. That's going to do a few things. It's going to make it easier to go together. It's going to help prevent any air leaks by kind of sealing up any areas to our threads. And it's going to kind of cut down on paint buildup. So we've got these assembled on here. And you can see how easy this makes this assembly. Push it in. Like I said, the tool will keep everything aligned as it's getting tightened down. Snug, but not over tightened. Okay, our needle packing is back in. We're going to go ahead and put our trigger back on at this point. We're going to put this little wavy washer under this side. And our pin without a hole goes in the top. And sometimes you got to wiggle this around a little bit to get everything lined up. Okay, our pin's through. I'm going to hold some pressure against the pin from the bottom. I'm going to just lay the clip on the trigger and then push it into place. A lot of times what I will do is cover this with my thumb as I do it to make sure it doesn't bounce off in case it slips, but just so you can see what I'm doing, I'm not going to do that. There, that's in place. Our bottom pin, same thing. Don't really worry about the hole alignment at this point. That's easy to spin as we're putting it together. Okay, we've got our clip laying on the trigger, holding the pin from the bottom. Pushed into place. Okay. We are now going to reassemble the air distribution ring. This is another place that we want to use this grease on this little alignment peg. It's really going to help that peg slide into where it's supposed to be, and it will help with reassembly next time, help to keep it from getting frozen. So this little alignment pin on the back side, if you can see it, there it is going to go into this top hole. And that just makes sure that the air distribution ring is rotated. It's kind of clocked the correct direction. On the front side, we can see a little mark, little line that's in the vertical position to help us line it up as we're putting it together. So we're going to get it lined up, and then we're just going to push it in with some thumb pressure. And when it's lined up, you should be able to feel it. It doesn't click in, it just kind of pushes in. We're going to look for a gap to make sure it's properly seated. It looks like it's pretty well down. The fluid tip will actually seat it the rest of the way as we put it in. So let's go ahead and do that. This is another area where you definitely want to use some gun grease. Big reason is it helps seal this part. We're usually not going to get paint leakage out of that, but you can have air get sucked into the gun, which again will kind of cause a machine gun effect, a sputtering as you're spraying. So if you run into that where the gun is kind of sputtering, this is about the first place I look to make sure that is snug and we have some grease in it to make sure it's kind of filling in those threads. Put it in by hand till it's down tight. Then we're carefully going to put the wrench on it and snug it up. Again, don't over tighten it, but if we don't get it tight enough, we're going to have that air leak. So we want to avoid that. Let's go ahead and reassemble our air cap since we took it apart. Drops in. I'm going to hold it from the bottom. And this can kind of sometimes be one of the pain parts, reassembling this ring onto its channel. You're just going to kind of get one side started and then just kind of work it around until it snaps down into place. We want to be careful with this black ring. If this black ring is out of place when we put the air cap back on it, it can catch in the threads and actually tear it or damage it. So we want to be sure that it's kind of up towards the front of its channel. And as you're tightening this down, if it doesn't feel right, stop what you're doing recheck that to make sure it's where it's supposed to be, because they are easy to damage, and I don't know if they're easy to come by now. I know at one time they were hard to come by. So we're going to put it on, and you really don't feel any resistance until the last second where it's snug. If you do start to feel some resistance in threads where this portion is still real loose, but you're tight on the ring, that's where you're pinching that black ring. Go ahead and make sure it's where it's supposed to be before you continue. We're going to align it so that our laser etching is correct. If it's upside down, we want to spin it. My understanding is at the factory they test spray these guns with the air cap in both positions, and then which one is better, they call that up, and then they will laser etch it to keep track of it. Okay, that's reassembled. Now we're going to put our needle back in. This is the last place, really, where I am real careful about using grease. Again, we're going to avoid some air leaks between the gasket, that needle packing, and the needle. And it really helps the needle slide in and out a lot better. It kind of avoids some of the paint build up on that, and it cuts down on wear of the needle packing. So I kind of put it towards the end, spin it around, and then as you put it into place, it's going to slide back where it needs to be. I'm going to use the tip to kind of line up the hole in that pin. Slide it into place. We can use some grease here too. And as you use it, it'll get put into place. Excuse me. We're going to assemble this all the way to the rear. Push in against the spring, start the screw. Now, the way to set this is once we get it started, I'm going to pull the trigger to the rear, and then we're going to tighten this until it starts to push the trigger forward. And you can see it just barely move. You can feel it more than anything. So as soon as it starts to push the trigger forward, we're going to stop threading this in, and we're going to move that set screw to the front and then lock the whole thing in. By doing that, we make sure that the gun is set to wide open. So when we pull the trigger, the needle's coming all the way to the rear. And we use the lock ring to make sure it doesn't back out. It's a good practice as you're using the gun to just to kind of grab both those parts together every once in a while and make sure it's snug, not backing off on you. Because it's, believe me, it's no fun to be spraying and that portion pops off. So that pretty much covers the disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly of the SATA JET NR3000. I appreciate you watching to this point. If you got some value out of it, please give it a like, and better yet, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be taking a look at lots of other equipment and showing you how to use it. Until next time, thank you, and thanks for joining me in the paint shop.